The field still slept when the horizon began to pale. Mist gathered in the shallow places, and the night's last crickets traded their thin music for silence. A single thrush called once, testing the hush, then tucked its head beneath its wing again. All around the world lingered in half-dream, held by the cool breath that arrives just before dawn. In that breath, the first farmer woke. He did not sit up at once. He listened, chest against ground, to the patient thrum deep in the soil, as though the earth itself inhaled with him. When he finally rose, dew brushed his knees, and the wide plain lay before him, an undulating quilt of ochre sand and charcoal loam, stitched with the faint green of early spring shoots. No fences, no roads, only distance and promise. If you've been walking these quiet fields with me tonight, stay a little longer. There is always another story, waiting like a seed beneath the soil. You can plant your own thoughts in the comments. I'll tend to them with care. And if you wish to return, you need only follow the path back here, like the sun finding the same horizon every morning. Subscribe, and the gate to this little village will always be open for you. Now, let's get back to story. He stood barefoot, feeling the delicate crust of nighttime hardness under his soles. Here, in an age before bronze or barley names, tools were whatever the land surrendered. A finger's width of antler, a curl of shell, a pebble broken with luck into a thin biting lip. On this particular dawn, the farmer's only companion was a branch the river had carried from the high hills. Ashwood, sun-bleached, its grain twisted into a gentle arc that settled perfectly into the soft web between thumb and forefinger. The branch had waited half a lifetime in flood-tumbled gravel. Now it waited in his hand. He weighed the length, tracing its bend against the shy light, and felt a wordless affection, as one might feel for a foal's first uncertain stance or the fragile crust on a newborn loaf. It was not yet a hoe, it was only possibility. He began his work by kneeling. Palms flattened, he explored yesterday's furrows, those shallow invitations he had etched at dusk with nothing but the blade of his own hand. Some had caved beneath night's settling dust. Some had hardened into ridges, each brittle edge catching the new light. He touched them all. Where the soil cracked, he breathed upon it. Where it slumped, he pressed gently, feeling for the hidden damp beneath. The ritual was slow, less task than conversation. The farmer murmured silent greetings to each stunted sprout of einkorn, every startled beetle, every root beginning its downward prayer. Nothing hurried. His bones remembered winters when rushing had broken them. Beyond the tilled patches, last season's stubble lay flattened like straw-gold scars. There, he paused. With the branch, he coaxed, loose one, thin stalk, examining its hollow. The empty tube reminded him how hunger roams inside all things, the seed gutting itself to grow, the body hollowing to wake. That knowledge did not frighten him. It merely shaped his patience. He laid the stalk aside and pressed the branch tip into the earth. The soil resisted, a shallow armor formed by sun and wind. He rocked his wrist. The branch squeaked, then slipped through, releasing a scent that lived between rain and stone, the clean scent of beginnings. A bead of moisture surfaced, trembled, and vanished into the eager air. He scratched a narrow line, then another parallel, then a third, breathing in the quiet rhythm. Draw, pause, lean back, listen. In each pause he noticed small citizens of the field, the click of a grasshopper's wing, the hush of an ant descending a clod, the hushier sound of clouds drifting far overhead. These whispers stitched themselves into his pulse until branch, heartbeat, and wind kept time together. When he bent to widen the furrows, he used not force but repetition, letting the branch surf the grain of soil, again and again, shaving, sighing, softening. It was work, yet it felt like rocking a child. Tiring, but in a circle that completes itself. The sun made no haste. Even as it cleared the distant ridge, its rays walked softly, spilling amber over stone outcrops, over the distant river's bronze flash. Warmth loosened the hardened earth, and the farmer's bare feet sank a finger deeper. He welcomed the pull of dampness between toes, the slight suction that promised the soil still carried last week's rain. Above the horizon, smoke from a far-off camp coiled into blue-gray ribbons. Someone else, unseen, tended their own dawn. The farmer did not wave, but his spirit nodded. A quiet acknowledgement of kinship among strangers who share sky. Mid-morning found him squatting beside a patch where wild vetch had sprawled. Its tender stems clung to one another in a green tangle, leaves feathered like sleeping eyelids. He worked carefully here, easing the branch tip beneath delicate roots to lift rather than sever. Long ago, he learned that removal was less valuable than relocation. He nudged each plant to the edge of his plot, pressing them into fresh hollows where their nitrogen-rich bodies could feed next season's grain. This stewardship, moving life instead of ending it, felt as natural as exhaling. The branch was no scythe. It was a fingertip reaching farther than fingers could. By noon, the air shimmered. He retreated to the shadow offered by a solitary tamarisk at the plain's edge. Its branches rattled softly, spitting silver scales of light across the dust. The farmer drank from a leather pouch, half-fermented water sweetened by a sliver of a honeycomb. He licked his lips, tasting earth in the sweetness, and allowed himself the luxury of stillness. Between heartbeats, he listened for the ground's subtle conversations, worms turning, roots creaking, stones cooling on one side and warming on the other. Each sound folded into the slow story the plane had been telling since it first shrugged off the sea. When the heat gentled, he returned to the rows. Afternoon wind slicked across the surface, tugging at his sweat-damp hair, carrying fine grains of silt that floated like ghosts over the furrows. He angled his branch, using its curved spine as a shield, pressing down where gusts threatened to erase the morning's care. The soil was living parchment, wind the unseen editor. The farmer allowed minor edits but guarded the sentence of each row. In their simple geometry, parallel, patient, he saw echoes of sunrises past and harvests yet unborn. He thought of unborn children too, and ancestral bones behind him, and the way each drew nourishment from the same dark cradle. Late day found shadows stretching long, thin fingers between rows. Light pooled copper at the furrow bottoms, turning each into a miniature canyon where air cooled first. Here, seeds would one day find refuge from blazing sun. For now, the farmer crouched and whispered into those tiny valleys. Not words, but breath. Warm and moist, a blessing more ancient than language. Overhead, a kestrel hung motionless on invisible threads, then folded its wings and slipped beyond sight. The field absorbed the hush left behind. He rose slowly, vertebrae unfolding like stacked stones returning to balance. Arms heavy, but heart light, he walked the perimeter once more, scanning for stones the size of his fist. Each he pried loose with the branch and carried to a growing cairn near the tamarisk. One day, these stones might border the plot, directing scarce water or discouraging grazing deer. For now, they simply waited, heat radiating from their ochre skins as twilight lapped at the edges of the sky. When the first star pricked through the violet seam, he set the branch upright in the softest soil, like a mast upon a dark ocean, and stepped back. The branch swayed, found its center, and stood. A silent agreement. The earth would hold the tool tonight. The tool would remember the lines of the day, and the farmer would dream of seeds. He turned toward his low hearth of stones, where a single coal slept beneath yesterday's ash. Kneeling, he breathed until a red eye opened, then coaxed a thin flame to life. Around him, the field cooled, exhaling the day's stored warmth in scented threads of loam and crushed grass. The branch remained silhouetted against a sky now thick with constellations as old as hunger. It looked, in that blue darkness, less like wood and more like a thought made solid. Evidence that intent can sprout from silence, that patience can wear the shape of a humble stick. He ate a small meal of dried figs and ground acorn, chewed slowly, letting their sweetness carry him deeper into evening. Across the plain, jackals began a distant, half-hearted song, more mumble than howl. The farmer hummed back, a low vibration in his chest, matching their refrain with something softer, steadier. It was a lullaby for the soil, for the seeds still tucked in his satchel, for his own muscles. Sated, he banked the fire and lay upon his side, head pillowed on one arm, the other tracing circles in dust, a ritual as drowsy as the spiral shells he sometimes found at river bends. Above, the moon climbed, swollen with early spring brightness, painting each furrow in alternating silver and shadow. The branch, too, caught the light, a pale arc poised between earth and sky. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would lash a flake of flint to its end, or carve a notch near the grip so his palm could rest more easily. Perhaps not. The plan did not matter. Only the listening did, the readiness to notice when a tool wished to change shape or when the soil wished to rest unbroken. Somewhere beyond the field, reeds clattered in a sudden breeze, and a tiny swirl of dust passed over his sleeping fire. The farmer's eyelids fluttered. Night deepened, pulling stars closer. Within that growing hush, the branch leaned ever so slightly, pointing toward the first row of the day, as though reminding both soil and dreamer of the mark they had begun. And so, in the tender wedge of darkness before true sleep, the first farmer's breath slowed to the rhythm of distant rivers, and his story, like the branch itself, waited, ready to press farther into the earth with the next dawn's gentle light. Morning uncurled itself slowly, like the leaf of a new plant remembering light. Mist clung low to the ground, softening the angles of the field where yesterday's furrows still lingered in quiet lines. The branch, his tool, his companion, stood where he had left it, upright in the earth, dew beating along its grain. The wind passed low and silent, careful not to tip it. Somewhere in the reeds, a frog offered a sluggish croak. Insects rustled awake. Beneath all this sound, the soil breathed. The first farmer rose from sleep with stiffness in his legs, but ease in his chest. There was something about the stillness of tools resting in soil, something that told him the day could begin without hurry. He stretched his arms behind his back and listened to the small sounds of bone and muscle loosening. Above him, a heron traced a long, slow arc across the pale sky, wings barely disturbing the air. He did not need to guess at the day's weather. The heron flew low. It would be dry. He moved first to the branch, placing one hand along its slender body and testing its grip. It fit differently now. Not because the wood had changed, but because his hand had begun to remember it. There was a certain place where his fingers knew to settle, where the slight bend met the crease of his palm, where the dry smoothness reassured his grip. He had not carved it. The fit was shaped by use, not by plan. With the stick held lightly in his grasp, he walked to the edge of the field, where old grass clung to a seam of sandy soil. It was there that he first tested the new movement, not stabbing, not scraping, but sliding. The stick moved forward like a finger drawing in ash. A small furrow opened beneath its tip. He tried again, forward, pull, forward again. this time with his left hand resting at the base for control. The line deepened. The soil responded. It gave just enough. His breath matched the rhythm. Each motion felt quieter than thought, as if his body were not doing a task but remembering a song. The stick wasn't perfect. Sometimes it caught at a root or bent too much when he leaned. But it didn't complain. That was the difference. The best tools were quiet ones. By mid-morning, his roughs curved gently across the field's edge like ribs beneath a sleeping body. Each arc was slightly different, shaped by the stones beneath, the slope of the land, the twitch of his hand. He didn't seek symmetry. He sought something softer, continuity, a curve that echoed itself, as the moon echoed the pond, as breath echoed breath. In a shaded corner near the tamarisk, he paused to rest. He sat with his back against the bark and laid the stick across his knees. His fingers traced the grain. Somewhere along the wood's length, he felt a small notch. Something uncarved, perhaps made by the river's wear. It caught the pad of his thumb just so, and he pressed into it gently. The knot in the wood pressed back. It was as if the stick were acknowledging him. He remembered how, in early seasons, he had tried many things. Flat stones, brittle bones, even the sharp tip of a broken antler. All had failed him, not for lack of sharpness or strength, but for lack of rest. None had felt right in his hand. This branch did not fight his fingers. It listened, and in return, it allowed itself to be shaped. Not by fire or carving, but by his grip, by his sweat, by his long, slow days of turning earth. After resting, he began again, this time near the center of the field. He used the stick now to clear away thin, wandering roots, each one like a thread in the great weave of the underground. He moved carefully, gently twisting the stick beneath each root and lifting it to one side. In this motion, the stick was not a blade. It was an extension of care. Clouds began to gather low in the east. Nothing threatening, just the usual bruises of spring sky. They shifted the light, softening it further, and for a while the field seemed to glow from within. The stick in his hand now bore faint smudges of earth and oil. It had begun to darken where his fingers most often held it. This pleased him, not as pride, but as a quiet sign that the tool was learning too. As he worked, a beetle climbed up the shaft and paused at his wrist. He watched it, the shimmer of its back catching flecks of amber light. The beetle did not fear him, or perhaps it did not know how. It wandered to the crook of his thumb, paused, then turned and made its way down the other side of the stick. When it reached the soil, it vanished into a groove he had just made. The furrow had become a path. The tool had become a home. He smiled faintly at this, not because it was amusing, but because it was enough. That a furrow might guide not only seeds, but life already moving in the dust. This was the rhythm the farmer trusted. One thing making space for another, again and again, until the field was full. He stood then and stepped back to look at the rows as a whole. From this angle, with the sun beginning to fall behind the hills, they looked like ripples caught in the moment before a pond stills. He walked along them, dragging the stick beside him, not to plow now, but to feel the memory of each line. The stick touched the edge of each furrow lightly, as if blessing it, and he whispered something small into the wind. Perhaps a word, perhaps only breath. Evening came without announcement. Shadows lengthened, the birds grew quieter, and the air cooled. He placed the stick upright again in the soil, not where it had stood yesterday, but in a new place, closer to where tomorrow's work would begin. He watched it for a moment, then placed a single stone beside it. That was his way of remembering. Then he turned toward the tamarisk and walked the familiar path homeward, where a low fire and a bowl of roots waited. And behind him, the stick stood in its furrow like an old friend keeping watch, silent, worn, and shaped by a hand that asked only for patience. The wind shifted before dawn, rising from the south like a whisper from the bones of the earth. It carried dryness in it, dryness that settled into the cracks of the land, into the hollows between stones, into the first farmer's joints as he lay curled beneath the branches of the tamarisk. He stirred in the brittle hush, eyes blinking into a sky still the color of charcoal. There had been no rain in many days. The moisture from last week's storm had sunk too deep or vanished too quickly. The ground, once pliable under his hand, now bore the hardness of silence. It no longer yielded. It waited. He rose slowly, barefoot again, and walked out toward the edge of the field. The grass beneath his toes crackled where it used to bend. He paused, looking down at the lines carved with the stick, the rows that had held yesterday's promise. Now they were thinner, their edges flaking, soil pulling away from itself like parched lips. He knelt beside the first row and placed his palm flat against the crust. It was warm already. The sun hadn't even arrived, and yet the earth radiated heat like coals buried beneath. He reached for the stick. Its surface was drier too, lighter in weight, as though it had exhaled its last drink of water overnight. It still fit his hand, but the wood now echoed the land, cracked, light, listening. He drew it across the surface, testing the soil. Where it had once parted with ease, the crust now resisted. The branch stuttered, jumped, scraped with a shrillness he didn't like. Still, he continued. One line. Then another. If the land had hardened, he would learn its new shape. He didn't blame it. Dryness was not betrayal. It was just another part of the turning. He shifted position, kneeling farther from yesterday's work. There, where he had not yet broken ground, the crust was smoother. He dug in, using more pressure, letting his shoulder lead the motion. The stick flexed beneath his weight. Dust lifted, caught in the faint morning breeze, and hung for a moment in the golden air. It smelled like crushed shell and old sun. His fingers followed the groove, feeling for depth, for resistance, for hidden stones. By midday, he had made little progress. The field did not wish to open, even the beetles stayed hidden. He paused beneath a thorned acacia, letting its sparse shade fall across his back. There was no stream nearby. He had only a small pouch of stored water, and he took just one sip. The taste was warm, faintly metallic. He did not grimace. He let it roll down his throat like a memory. From beneath his belt, he pulled a fragment of horn. He'd found it moons ago near a dry riverbed, a broken piece of antelope, jagged at one end and worn smooth at the other. He had never thought to use it, but now, as the soil pushed back, he considered its edge. He placed it in his other hand, opposite the stick, and returned to the crust. The horn tip jabbed better, splitting small seams. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. A few inches of dirt gave way, revealing darker soil beneath, where the sun had not reached. He crouched over that patch for a long while, alternating between the stick and the horn, scraping in small arcs, carving just enough room for a seed to rest. It was tedious. The lines were no longer straight. His breath came heavier, and sweat pooled at the base of his spine. Yet he found a rhythm in the struggle. A rhythm slower than before, one that demanded pause, correction, adjustment. Every few moments he leaned back, resting on his heels, looking at what he had made. It wasn't much, but it was something. He thought of his father, not as a voice, but as a motion, a hand on shoulder, a nod. His father had worked with no stick at all. only fingers and flint. Back then, the soil had been softer, or perhaps the memory had been. The first farmer wondered if, someday, someone else would find his stick in the dust and call it crude. The thought did not sadden him. Everything had its season, even tools, even hands. The afternoon deepened into the ochre heat of late day. Shadows shrank. The wind quieted. He pressed his palm to the soil again and felt its thrum, fainter now, but still there. It reminded him of the last breath before sleep. Not gone, just waiting. He pressed harder with the horn, digging a line no longer than his forearm, and then again with the stick, widening the path just enough to catch rain if it ever came. The dust clung to his arms like ash. A stone caught the horn's edge and split it. He paused, holding the two pieces. One fell to the side. The other he tucked into the belt again, unfinished. He did not curse. The soil had only answered honestly. He was the one who asked too much. As dusk folded the light into softer colors, he gathered the broken horn, the worn stick, and the handful of seeds from his satchel. He pressed the seeds into the deepest grooves he'd managed to carve. Not many, just a dozen, maybe fewer. He covered them gently, using the palm of his hand and the bend of the stick to drag soil across like a blanket. He whispered nothing, only pressed. He placed a small stone upright beside the first row to mark where effort had begun. The rest he left untouched. The sky above him bruised violet, and the stars returned. Far off, a jackal yawned. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees, and turned away from the field. Behind him, the ground kept its silence. In the fading light, the scratch marks of his labor gleamed faintly. Not wounds, but waiting places, and the stick, still warm from his grip, whispered its readiness for tomorrow. The wind had changed again in the night. It came now from the west, brushing the tops of grasses in the dark and whispering dry secrets to the stones that lined the far bend of the river. When the first farmer rose, the sky above was dappled with streaks of thin cloud, the color of old bone. He gathered his things slowly. The stick was still there, leaning against a worn stone by the hearth. But this morning, his hand hesitated before reaching for it. Something in the day felt different. Not in the soil, not in the body, but somewhere deeper, in the rhythm of the wind, and the way his thoughts did not settle as quickly as usual. He took the stick anyway, but loosely, as though it were no longer the only voice worth listening to. He walked toward the river bend, not to work, but to wander. His legs knew the way. The path braided through reeds and between stones smooth from centuries of water thought. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and everything shivered in pale blue stillness. At the edge of the shallows, where water lapped with sleepy rhythm, something caught his eye. A shape just beneath the surface. A shimmer unlike any he'd seen in moons. He crouched slowly, letting his fingertips break the surface first. The cold bit up his arms, but he didn't flinch. His hand found the shape and lifted it. Obsidian, black as midnight with a skin like cooled fire. A single flake, no larger than a hand's breadth, but sharp on one edge, so sharp it seemed the air bent slightly as it passed. The first farmer held it up to the light. It caught the sun's first ray and threw it back in silence. He had seen stones before, of course, used them even. But this was different. This one had already decided what it was. It didn't need shaping. It needed only to be held right. He turned the flake in his hand, letting its edge kiss his thumbprint. It bit without piercing, just enough to remind him. This stone was not for scraping or hammering. It was for slicing, for tracing the lines the soil had hidden. He sat beside the river and studied it, not rushing to assign purpose. The birds began their morning chatter. Somewhere upstream, a fish leapt, then disappeared again with a splash that rippled out like a slow drumbeat. When he returned to the field, the stick was still with him, but now it shared space with the stone. He didn't bind them together, not yet. He needed to know how they spoke to the earth separately before joining them. At the edge of yesterday's hard ground, he knelt and tested the obsidian. No pressure, just a glide. The stone slipped under the crust like a whisper beneath a closed door. It parted roots. It moved aside grit. It followed the line of old furrows not by force, but by awareness. The first farmer worked slowly, using the obsidian flake like a fingertip sharper than his own. He did not gouge the ground. He merely suggested that it open, and it did. The stick was good for drawing, coaxing, shaping, but the stone was different. The stone was for listening to what lay just beneath, for discovering the tension points of soil and unraveling them one by one. Soon, he found himself switching tools mid-row. A furrow might begin with the stick, rough and curving, then find its clarity in a final pass with the stone. Where a root grew thick, he paused and let the stone trace around it like a stream would wrap around a rock. Nothing was torn. Everything was persuaded. Midday passed unnoticed. The air warmed, but not enough to sting. Clouds drifted above like grazing beasts. The obsidian never dulled. His fingers, though, began to feel its song too sharply. By late afternoon, his hands were marked. Thin, red lines along his thumb and forefinger. Tiny gifts of the stone's sharp truth. He did not wrap them. He simply placed the flake on a flat rock to rest and soaked his hands in the shallow stream that bordered the field. The cuts stung, then cooled, then pulsed with something that was not pain, but understanding. He thought then about edges, about the places where things ended and others began, the edge of the field, the edge of the day, the edge of a wordless thought as it shaped itself into a movement. The obsidian had taught him not all tools were meant to last forever. Some were only meant to show him something, then return to sleep. He looked back at the flake. Its black gleam had dulled slightly under the dust, but still it seemed alive. As twilight bloomed, he stood beside the fire, the flake now wrapped gently in a twist of soft bark. He did not place it with the others. It wasn't like them. He set it beneath the stone where he slept, close to the heat of dreams. The stick still leaned nearby, weathered now, familiar. But even it seemed quieter tonight, as if acknowledging that something sharper had joined the chorus. The wind returned just before sleep. Not loud, just enough to rattle the grass and press the scent of damp soil against the edges of the tinted sky. The first farmer listened, to wind, to stone, to memory, and to the small secret lines still waiting to be found in the morning's first light. The clouds had been gathering for days, not in haste, not with drama, just slow spirals of silver that thickened above the hills, arriving in silence like a herd returning to the fold. The first farmer had watched them with the steady eyes of someone who had long since stopped predicting the sky. Rain did not come when it called. It came when it remembered. And this time, it remembered just as he was folding his sleeping cloth, just as the stick found its place again in his hand. The air was heavy before the first drop fell, not hot, just full. Full of something unseen, something waiting to become weight. The birds quieted. The insects whispered among themselves. Even the soil seemed to tense, as though lifting its face toward something familiar. The first farmer stood still in the center of his field. The obsidian flake rested in its bark cradle by the tamarisk tree, not needed today. Today would be different. When the rain came, it came without sound. The first drops landed like breath on the brow, cool, small, and scattered, then more, then many. A rhythm, but no violence, the kind of rain that does not fall from above, but gathers all around you until the very air is water. He did not run for cover. He stayed where he was, arms loose, head tilted back. His skin drank it in. The field responded first in color. Dust deepened, crusts softened. The paleness of the tilled rows turned a deeper brown, richer, sweeter smelling. He walked slowly across the rows, watching them change. Where he had once scratched and scraped, the earth now opened of its own accord. The tiny furrows widened, thickened. Rain pooled inside them, ran along them like tiny silver snakes. For the first time in many days, the land was digging itself. He dropped to his knees at the edge of one row and placed his hand flat in the water-slick soil. It was warm still, but no longer dry. It yielded under his fingers with a low, grateful sigh. He pressed lightly and felt the mud curl around his fingertips. He dug not to work, but to feel. The ground had become soft again, not by effort, not by blade or stick, but by the slow grace of sky remembering earth. He looked toward the cluster of young shoots he had planted the week before. They quivered in the rain but held fast. The water slid down their pale stems, collected at their roots, and disappeared into the earth below. He smiled faintly. Some part of him had doubted they'd survive the dry week, but here they were. Still green, still small, still believing. He let the stick rest at his side and began walking the edges of his plot with nothing in his hands at all. Just his body, just his breath. His feet sank slightly with every step. The soil clung to his soles, then let go. The rows glistened like wet carvings, and the water moved between them with quiet purpose. No digging needed, no cutting or shaping, just waiting, just watching. By midday, the rain had thickened, but still it held no malice. It was the kind of rain that built rivers without floods, softened stones without shattering them. He sat beneath the tamarisk and watched as the water carried away bits of husk, bits of old dust, broken roots that no longer had work to do. The rain was not just softening, it was choosing. It knew what to lift and what to leave. He noticed how the low places in his field, those shallow bowls where his stick had faltered, were now full. The water gathered there, soaking deep. Those would be the spots where the grain grew tallest. Not the perfect lines, not the even rows, but the places shaped by failure, the places that sank beneath his hand. In the afternoon, when the light had flattened and the sky pulsed gray, he moved again. Not to work, just to rearrange. He nudged a few small stones into place, guiding the rivulets where they wanted to go. He touched the tops of the young plants, brushing rain from their tender leaves. He placed his palm over a seed mound and felt the cool breath of water seeping in from below. And in all of it, the digging was done not by him, but by the world. The stick remained in his hand, but more like a walking staff now, a companion, not a tool. He leaned on it gently as he made his rounds, using it to steady his steps across the slickened earth. The ground was softer now, but not treacherous. It welcomed his weight. As evening approached, the rain began to thin. Not stop, just soften again, becoming mist, then hush, then memory. He stood at the field's edge, soaked through but warm. The clouds were breaking apart at the edges, peeling away to reveal the faintest blue. The sun, low and golden, found its way through a tear in the sky and cast long shadows across the water-slick rows. Every furrow glittered. The whole field shimmered like a mirror that had finally remembered how to reflect. He raised the stick and drew a slow, wide arc in the air, not to mark, not to measure, but simply to feel the motion. The weight of it in his hand felt different now, lighter, less burdened. as though it too had been washed. He crouched near one of the deeper furrows and reached down. The soil was pliable, dark, ready. He pressed his thumb into it and left an imprint that held its shape. Not long ago he had strained to dig even a shallow groove. Now the land opened to him with the softness of sleep. He leaned back and looked up. The clouds drifted eastward, slow and fat, their bellies emptied. The sky above was pale and rinsed clean. A cool wind began to move across the plain, lifting scents from the field. Wet earth, crushed green, and something sweet like distant blossoms not yet bloomed. He breathed it all in. As night came, he laid the stick at the foot of the tamarisk and sat beside it, watching the stars blink one by one into view. The obsidian flake remained, untouched. It had not been needed. Not today. Today the digging had been done not by edge, not by force, but by grace. The world had done what he could not, and for that he was grateful. He closed his eyes, leaned his head against the tree's rough bark, and let the last raindrops trace lines down his face. The soil around him was full again, not just with water, but with time, with breath, with possibility. He would sleep with mud still under his nails, and tomorrow, when the sun returned, he would follow the paths the rain had written in the earth. Lines curved not by his hand, but by the sky itself. The sky was clear the next morning, scrubbed pale by the night winds that had followed the rain. Where puddles once gathered now shimmered patches of wet soil, breathing steam into the cool morning air. The first farmer stirred from sleep before the mist had lifted, his blanket heavy with damp, his thoughts still slow and mossy with dreams. Somewhere in those dreams, a root had whispered to him, not in words, but in sensation. Something twisting gently, not resisting, only reminding. He opened his eyes with the trace of it still lingering in his palms. The stick waited for him, lying where he had left it beneath the tamarisk. It was darker now, soaked through along the grain, the color of bark after storm. He touched it lightly, then held it for a moment without moving. It seemed softer, heavier, more thoughtful somehow, as if it too had listened to the rain. Then, without rush, he walked toward the northern edge of his field, the place where the wild yam vines crept low and curled their leaves like sleeping hands. This part of the field had not yet been disturbed. The earth here was not meant for grain. It belonged to the quiet things that grew in secret, tubers, knots, burrowing lives that fed without reaching toward the sun. He had not planned to dig them. Not yet. But the dream had pointed him here, and so he followed. He knelt at the base of a leafy cluster and brushed the soil aside with his fingers first. Not the stick. He wanted to feel the truth of it. The ground gave easily, still remembering the rain. His nails found the soft neck of the root just beneath the surface. He didn't pull. He only followed. The yam stretched deeper, its shape round and firm, its skin textured like aged leather. He slid his hand around it and felt the resistance, not protest, but a steady pressure. A message, not now. He sat back on his heels and looked at the plant. The leaves trembled in the slight breeze. The stem held firm, coiled slightly at the base. This root was not ready. He nodded, almost amused. So be it. He moved to the next one. This one was different. The soil, looser, the stem, thinner. He brushed gently and found the upper swell of the root nearer to the air. It gave way beneath his fingers, a soft release. He took the stick and used its rounded end to dig around the edges, slow circles that widened the hole without touching the root itself. The earth fell away in damp flakes. The yam shifted. When he lifted it, it came free with a sigh. He held it in both hands, a strange shape, half moon, half flame, warm from the soil's cradle. He examined the fine root hairs still clinging to its base, the small scars of stones it had grown against. This root had struggled in its own way, but it had chosen to rise. That mattered. He placed it beside him, then moved on. By mid-morning, he had harvested only 3. Many he left untouched, sensing their hesitance. Others he circled gently, loosening their homes but not removing them. He was learning to listen with more than his hands. The roots spoke in firmness, in stillness, in the angle of their growth. A root that bent sharply near the surface wanted out. A root that sank straight and deep still drank from something unseen. The stick became less of a digger and more of a guide. He used it to trace the paths around the plants, to tease away clods without tearing the threads. Its tip, rounded by rain and time, was just blunt enough to be kind. When he struck a stone, he paused and adjusted. When he felt the stick catch on something soft, he withdrew. In the stillness of that slow work, the field became a quiet teacher. Birds landed nearby, unafraid. A hare darted past, leaving tiny footprints in the mud. Even the clouds moved gently overhead, not in a hurry to change the light. The first farmer worked in a rhythm that matched his breath. Not every pull was a harvest. Some were simply acknowledgments. Not this one, not yet, maybe tomorrow. As the sun climbed, he shaded himself beneath a bundle of dried reeds he had stacked weeks earlier, creating a lean shelter at the edge of the yam patch. He drank water in small sips, letting it rest in his mouth before swallowing. The yams he had gathered sat in a neat row beside him, their skins beginning to dry in the light. They were not many, but they were enough. He thought of how, once, he would have dug every root at once, scraped the earth bare for fear of scarcity. But the field had changed him. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and he was only now softening enough to feel it. The roots did not hoard, they did not rush. They took what they needed, and no more. They waited until they were ready to be found, and then they gave themselves freely. In the later hours of the day, he dug no more. He only walked, barefoot, between the plants, touching leaves, pressing soil, memorizing shapes. He found a vine that had grown in a full circle, a perfect loop nestled flat against the ground. He crouched beside it, marveling. How had it known to bend so precisely? What had it followed? He placed a small stone in its center and whispered something. Perhaps a blessing, perhaps nothing at all. As the sun began to lower, he gathered the few harvested yams and placed them in a woven sling. He did not cover them. They needed air. Their scent would follow him home, a reminder of the day's small teachings. The stick remained in his hand, though he barely used it now. It was a walking memory, a reminder of how tools must learn to be gentle, how the hand must adapt to what the root requires, not the other way around. When he reached the tamarisk, he set the yams in a shallow pit lined with dry grass. They would rest there overnight. Then he placed the stick beside the hearthstone and knelt beside it. He took a small piece of damp earth and rubbed it along the wood grain, a gesture of gratitude, of care. Night gathered itself above him, slow and blue. The stars blinked awake. The field behind him exhaled, and in the darkness, roots shifted in the deep, unseen, still growing, still teaching. The morning came with a strange hush, as if the world were waiting for something not yet born. The wind had gone elsewhere, and the sky above the first farmer's field wore a flat white veil, neither warm nor cold. Even the birds seemed to pause between their usual morning songs. The earth, damp from the day before, held the scent of waking roots and softened stone. He rose slowly, brushing sleep from his face, and walked without speaking toward the water's edge, where the reeds grew thick and the air carried the tang of salt and algae. The tide was low. The river, wide and slow, peeled back to reveal the sandbanks littered with broken things. Shells mostly, white, pink, amber-colored, some chipped, some hollow, some smooth as polished bone. He wandered quietly along the edge, his eyes scanning not for food, but for shape. Something had tugged at his thoughts in the night. A dream not of furrows or seeds, but of scooping, of lifting, of carrying earth like water. He hadn't understood it when he woke, but now, here among the scattered shells, it came back with a slow certainty. His hand hovered over a conch split clean in half, its open belly still holding a few grains of wet silt. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand. It was lighter than it looked. The edge of the break curved gently, not sharp, worn down by time and the rhythm of waves. It sat easily in his palm, like a ladle made by accident. He scooped into the wet sand and lifted. The soil cradled within did not slip. It sat there, cupped perfectly. A tool, then, one not carved, not fashioned by fire or flint, but shaped by the patient work of water and time. He returned to the field with the shell resting carefully in the crook of his elbow, protected from the breeze that had begun to stir again. The ground was still moist, pliant from days of cloud and rain, but in places it had pooled into uneven mounds, carried there by the slow wandering of water. He had learned to trust the way soil moved, but he had also learned that sometimes it needed guiding, redistribution, not removal. The stick was too straight, the stone too harsh. But this shell might carry the earth without disturbing it. He knelt at the edge of one shallow depression and dipped the shell into the heavier mound beside it. The soil lifted smoothly, without spilling. He turned his wrist and poured it down into the hollow, again and again. The sound was different from digging, softer, like hands folding cloth. No scraping, no tearing, only a hush, a shifting. The earth allowed itself to be moved. He worked that way for hours, not across the whole field, but in careful patches where the ground had become uneven. The shell let him carry soil in small breaths, moving it from where it gathered too thick to where it had thinned. He imagined it was like the way birds gather twigs, how they build something not from power, but from placement. There was a rhythm to it. Scoop, lift, pour, rest. Once, he stopped and held the shell up to his ear, remembering something he'd once been told, that you could hear the sea in a hollow like this. He listened, not for the sea, but for the sound of the soil shifting inside. It was there, a faint trickle, a weightless slide, like breath caught in a bowl. He smiled without knowing why. At midday, he rested beneath the tamarisk. The shell lay beside him on a flat stone, the sun warming its surface. He ran his thumb along its edge and felt the tiny grooves worn into it, the story of rivers, of time, of things broken that became something new. He thought of his own body, the joints that no longer moved quite as they once had, the lines on his face deepening like tree bark. He, too, was becoming hollow in places, and yet he still carried, still shaped the field. He returned to the work with less urgency, more curiosity. He used the shell not just to carry soil, but to smooth the edges of furrows, to press seeds lightly into damp earth, to draw soft lines between rows so the water would know where to go when the rains returned. The more he used it, the more he learned how little was needed. Just a tilt of the wrist. Just enough pressure to guide, not control, never that. The land did not respond well to control, but it answered gently to suggestion. By late afternoon, he had formed a small crescent of reshaped soil along the southern edge of the field. It curved around the young stalks like an arm. The plants there, einkorn, flax, and a few scattered lentils, stood a little taller now, their roots anchored more securely in the even ground. He crouched beside them, brushing the last loose soil over the base of a slender stem with the back of the shell. The plant didn't move, but he imagined it had noticed. The light grew golden as the sun bent westward. Shadows stretched across the field, long and soft, brushing the ground like fingers. He carried the shell with him as he walked the length of the rows one last time, touching the earth here and there, not to fix anything, but to acknowledge, to witness what had changed. When he reached the tamarisk, he did not place the shell among his other tools. Instead, he hung it on a low branch by a strip of woven reed, where it caught the last rays of the day and turned them into pale fire. It swayed gently in the breeze, humming a note too soft for ears, but clear enough for the soil. He sat beside it, listening to the sound the shell made as the wind passed through. It was not music, but it had rhythm. It reminded him of something deeper than thought, perhaps the sound of water beneath ground, or the way seeds speak to soil before they break open. He didn't need to understand it. He only needed to hear it. As the stars blinked one by one into the soft canvas above, he leaned back, folded his hands across his belly, and closed his eyes. The shell rocked once more, and then was still. The field breathed. And beneath the surface, the earth turned, carrying the memory of every gentle scoop, every silent pour, every small kindness shaped by a shell full of soil. The morning air was thin and sharp with smoke. A distant scent carried on the wind from fires long extinguished but never forgotten. The first farmer woke to it, still lingering in his nostrils, a reminder that life, like earth, was shaped not only by growth but also by burning. He rose slowly, muscles taut from the night's rest, and made his way to the hearth where the embers still glowed faintly beneath a bed of soft ash. The stick he held was heavier now, darkened not just by rain and soil, but by a fine dust that clung to it like memory. He touched the fire lightly, coaxing a thin thread of flame to flicker upward. Smoke curled in lazy spirals, weaving through the branches of the tamarisk above. The sky beyond was pale and cloudless, the sun yet to climb far enough to warm the chilled ground. The smell of burning wood, dry and ancient, filled the air like a whispered invitation. His fingers, stained with ash from yesterday's tending, brushed against the stick. The charred ends spoke to him, not with words but with a pulse. They told of endings and beginnings, of earth cleared and softened, of life returned to dust and then reborn. The fire had not been cruel. It had been careful, purposeful, a tool itself shaped by breath and hunger. He stood and walked toward the far edge of the field where the remnants of last season's clearing lay scattered. Blackened branches lay intertwined with brittle grasses, the soil beneath still smoldering in spots, sending tiny wisps of smoke to the sky. Here, the fire had done the digging that no hand could manage. It had cracked open the hardened earth, laid bare the stones beneath, and softened the ground for new roots to take hold. The stick, held firm in his grip, was both guide and witness. He used its charred tip to prod the soil, testing its softness. Where the ash lay thick, the earth welcomed the pressure, giving way with a quiet sigh. He scraped gently along the edges of the burnt patches, carving shallow furrows where seeds might soon be sown. His hands moved with care, tracing patterns that mirrored the unpredictable dance of fire itself. Curved lines, broken edges, spaces left open for light and air. The ash dust settled into his palms, clinging to skin and nails like a second layer. He did not mind. It was a reminder of the slow transformation happening beneath his feet. Midday sun filtered through the sparse canopy, casting flickering shadows that moved like ghosts across the ground. The heat was different here, drier, sharper. The smell of smoke mingled with the sweetness of fresh earth and the faint, resinous scent of tamarisk needles. The first farmer bent low, using the stick's charred tip to loosen clumps of soil, careful not to disturb the fragile crust where new shoots might push through. He thought about the fire's power, how it could destroy and create in the same breath, how ash became soil, how death fed life. The rhythm of his movement slowed, each scrape and press deliberate, respectful. This was no longer simple labor. It was an offering. Occasionally, he paused to touch the scorched wood of the stick, feeling the roughness beneath his fingers. The texture was unlike any he had known before, both brittle and resilient, a reminder that strength could come from transformation. He imagined the stick itself had been changed by the fire, as he had been changed by the land. As afternoon waned, clouds gathered again, softening the light. A cool breeze stirred, lifting ash from the ground in delicate spirals that caught the sun like tiny stars. The farmer stood and surveyed the field, a patchwork of dark and light, of char and soil, of endings that promised beginnings. He traced a finger along the furrow edges where the ash lay thickest and whispered a blessing for growth. Returning to the hearth, he laid the stick beside the embers and washed his hands in the cool water of a nearby stream. The ash came away slowly, leaving behind skin flushed pink with the day's work. He sat by the fire, watching the glow fade to embers, feeling the quiet weight of the land settling around him. Night fell soft and deep, the sky a vast tapestry of stars blinking steadily in the clear air. The stick, resting beside the hearth, was dark as the night itself, its ends charred but whole. The first farmer closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of smoke and earth, and let the stories of fire and ash carry him into sleep. A sleep full of soft renewal and patient waiting. The dawn was gentle and pale, a soft sigh before the sun's slow rise. The first farmer awoke with the first light, his body still carrying the tiredness of long days and patient nights. His hands ached in familiar ways, but his heart was steady. Beside his sleeping place, the stick leaned quietly, its surface worn smooth by weather and use. Today, however, it would carry a new burden. Yesterday, as he labored in the field, he had taken a stone, one he had found near the river's bend, and bound it to the end of his stick with strips of reed. The stone was sharp and heavy, promising. He had thought that with this, he might break through the harder soil more easily, carve deeper furrows without so much wear on his hands. It was an experiment, a hope shaped in mud and sweat. This morning, as he reached for the tool, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. The stone's edge had shattered during the last day's work, fractured into jagged shards that now clung precariously to the binding. He held it carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands entirely. The reed bindings were loose, frayed by use and weather. The weight was uneven, the promise broken. He knelt beside the tool and examined it slowly. The stone fragments glittered dully in the growing light. The sharpness was gone, replaced by rough edges that might tear as easily as they had cut. He pressed his thumb against one shard. It bit his skin, drawing a small line of blood. He did not flinch. This was part of the learning, part of the slow understanding that not every idea held. He laid the tool on the ground with care, as though it were a living thing that needed rest. The broken stone seemed to sigh beneath the morning air, shards shimmering like the scales of a fallen fish. He thought of the many things he had tried, sticks, bones, shells, and how each had its time and place. Not all tools were meant to last. Some were only meant to teach. He sat back on his heels and watched the field waking around him. The soil held its breath. ready to receive the sun's warmth. A flock of birds rose suddenly from the far reeds, their wings beating a soft rhythm against the quiet sky. Somewhere nearby, water gurgled over stones, moving always toward the sea. The world was patient. He reached out and picked up a handful of dry earth, letting it sift slowly through his fingers. The dust settled like soft snow around him. He thought of how the earth itself was made of fragments, broken stones, crushed bones, decayed roots, all woven together in endless cycles. Maybe tools were the same. Standing, he gathered a few more stones from the riverbed, each worn by water and time. He selected ones that were smaller, rounder, smoother, and laid them carefully in a small pile beside the broken tool. These might become something new. Not today, perhaps, but soon. He returned to the field, bare hands brushing the tops of young shoots, feeling the pulse of life beneath the crust. He moved carefully, not forcing, not rushing. Without the sharpness of the broken stone, he worked with the stick alone, its smooth surface cool and familiar. His muscles remembered the rhythm, the slow arc, the gentle pressure. By midday, the sun had warmed the land in his skin. Sweat traced lines down his back, and dust clung to his hands. He paused beneath a tamarisk, letting its shade cool his face. He looked at the tool pile again. The broken stone glinted faintly. He did not feel disappointment, only quiet acceptance. Evening came with the soft breeze that carried the scent of distant rain. He gathered the broken tool and the stones, wrapped them carefully in a strip of bark, and placed them near the fire. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would find a way to bind them anew, or choose a different stone, or maybe wait until the earth softened again. For now, they rested together, a testament to the slow dance of trial and patience. As the stars blinked awake overhead, the first farmer sat beside the hearth, the smooth stick resting across his knees, the broken stone a quiet presence nearby. The night was deep and full of shadow, but within it he felt the steady heartbeat of the land and his own, steady and unbroken despite the fragments. He closed his eyes and let the stories of stone and stick carry him gently into sleep. A sleep made whole by the promise of new beginnings born from what had broken too soon. The wind carried no dust that morning. It drifted in from the east, light and cool, moving through the tamarisk branches like fingers trailing across an old drum. The first farmer stirred beneath his woven blanket, but did not rise right away. Something about the air felt slower than usual, not heavy, not strange, only quiet in a deeper way. The kind of quiet that settles in after long effort, or before something important. He lay still for a while, listening to it. The breeze came in intervals, breathing around him, nudging the dry grass, whispering through the reeds near the water's edge. When he did rise, his body was not stiff, yet he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had already worked many days without counting. He stepped barefoot across the sleeping earth, the soles of his feet brushing morning dew off flattened blades of grass. His eyes wandered across the furrows he had made in past days, some fresh, some hardened again by sun, some half erased by wind. He noted where the soil had held, where the roots had risen, and where the water had pooled. But he did not reach for the stick. It leaned, as it always did, against the hearthstone, its grain darkened by ash, its end slightly split from wear, its body still shaped to the memory of his hand. He let it rest there. Today, the earth did not call for digging. Instead, he walked. Past the familiar rows, past the half-cleared patch he'd left unfinished, past the shell hanging from the branch that still caught the morning light. He walked the edge of the field with slow steps, his hands empty, the breath in his chest rising and falling like the rhythm of a sleeping animal. The field, too, felt asleep, not inert, not unfeeling, only still. He stopped often, crouched beside small chutes, ran his fingers through loosened soil, lifted stones that had surfaced overnight. But he dug nowhere. He thought of what the land had given him: grain, roots, shade, quietness, bruises, calluses, lessons. He thought, too, of what he had taken: water from deep pockets, clay for pots, sticks from young trees, seeds from pods barely full. He didn't regret any of it. But this morning, under the light of a soft and cloudless sky, he felt a kind of hush, as if the land had asked for one day of nothing, one day to breathe without fingers pressing into it. He wandered to the small pile of stones he'd gathered weeks ago, stones too jagged for use, too large to bury. They sat in a loose circle near the edge of the water. He sat with them. Cross-legged, back curved like a bow, he traced their edges, turned them one by one, stacked them gently until one tumbled, and then began again. The motion was small, easy, grounding. No purpose beyond being still. Birds passed above, one by one, their wings cutting paths in the air that disappeared behind them like soft lines drawn in water. He followed their movement with his eyes, but not with thought. Thought was slow today, too slow for naming. His mind, usually full of furrow lengths and seed counts and weather signs, now held only the shape of wind. He moved later to the tamarisk and sat in its shade, legs stretched before him, palms resting on the dust. The tree swayed gently, letting specks of light dance across his skin. A single leaf detached from above and spiraled down beside him. He picked it up, held it to the sky, and watched the light press through its veins like old stories seen from within. Still, he did not dig. Later, he opened a pouch of dried lentils and counted them without speaking. Not to measure, not to plan, just to know them. Their skins were rough, their shapes not quite even. He rolled a few between his fingers, then poured them back into the pouch. He did the same with the einkorn seed, the flax, the wild barley. Each texture was different. Each weight told him something only his fingertips could hear. He thought of all the times he had forced his hands to move, under sun, under wind, under the heaviness of knowing the season would not wait. He had learned discipline. He had learned persistence. But this was something else. A kind of discipline, too, but quieter. To sit, to watch, to let the field speak without interruption. By late day, the sun had climbed and begun its descent. Shadows stretched long across the soil, tracing old furrows like lines drawn in rest. Still, he had not lifted the stick. Still, the earth had not asked him to. He stood slowly and wandered back toward the center of the field. Where yesterday he had scraped lines for water to run, tiny shoots had pushed through. He crouched beside them, touched the green with the back of one finger. They were tender, but sure. They didn't need him today. They had found their own way through. He sat there until the light faded to amber, then rose and walked the same slow path back to the hearth. He passed the broken tool wrapped in bark, the shell hanging quiet now, the bowl of roots untouched. Everything was as it had been. When he reached the hearth, he finally picked up the stick. He turned it in his hand, felt its grain, its weight, its memory. Then he laid it back down. He would dig again, yes. Tomorrow, maybe, or the next day. The work was never finished. But today, he had honored the earth not with action, but with stillness. And in doing so, he had remembered that farming was not only about shaping the land, but being shaped by it in return. The fire crackled softly as dusk deepened. The first farmer sat beside it, empty-handed and full-hearted. The night rose gently around him, and the soil, undisturbed, breathed. The moon rose early that evening, pale and wide, balanced just above the dark line of the hills. Its light touched the first farmer's field before the sun had fully gone, casting long silvery shadows across the uneven ground. He stood at the edge of the tamarisk, one hand on the stick, watching the land breathe in that soft light. There was no fire yet, only the hush of twilight and the rustle of night's first stirring things. The wind was light, barely there, moving only enough to lift a strand of hair from his brow and carry it slowly toward the east. He had not planned to work tonight. The day had been long, but still. The sky had held no threat, and the soil had asked for nothing more than presence. But something in the way the moon leaned over the land, curious, steady, told him that tonight the ground might open in a way it never did beneath the sun. So he tied his cloak across his shoulders, picked up the stick and stepped into the field. The night air wrapped around him like cool cloth, brushing his cheeks, his neck, his fingers. The ground was soft underfoot, still holding the warmth of daylight but cooling quickly. He knelt near the southern rows where the sprouts were smaller, the soil looser. His hands moved without thought, fingers tracing lines already remembered. The stick followed his lead, its tip pressing gently into the dirt, carving grooves barely deep enough for a root to dream into. Under the moon, the soil seemed different, not just in light, but in feel. It gave with less resistance, not because it was softer, but because it trusted. The farmer sensed it in his bones. In the day, the ground guarded itself. In the night, it let down its guard. He whispered nothing, only breathed, slow and low, his breath fogging faintly in the cool. The stick made no sound as it worked, only a whisper of friction, like skin brushed against linen. Around him, the night insects began their gentle chorus. A cricket near the reeds sent out its rhythmic call. A moth brushed his cheek on its way to somewhere unseen. Overhead, the moon brightened, casting the rows in alternating bands of shadow and silver. The furrows became rivers of light. He traced them slowly, letting his mind quiet. He remembered other nights. Nights when he had stayed awake beside the fire, listening to distant jackals or watching stars blink into view. Nights when he had worked out of need, pushing his body past its peace. But tonight was different. He was not here to rush or harvest. He was here to listen, to the moon, to the soil, to himself. He moved to another patch, one where the soil had cracked slightly during the dry days. The cracks now welcomed the tip of his stick. He widened them carefully, making space for moisture to return when the next rain came. He traced the cracks not to fix them, but to acknowledge them. They had stories too. Time passed without measure. The stars shifted. The wind grew cooler. He felt the small ache in his knees, the dampness at the hem of his robe, the roughness of bark in his palm. But he did not stop. The furrows he carved were not many, perhaps only 10, but each was done with care. Not because the land demanded it, but because something quiet inside him did. When he finally sat back on his heels, the moon had climbed higher, directly above the field. Its light made the dust sparkle, the leaves shimmer like fish scales. He looked at the lines he had made, narrow, curved, imperfect, and yet they felt right. They belonged here in the hush of this hour. He laid the stick gently on the ground beside him and leaned back, hands resting on the cooling earth. He looked up, past the branches, past the light, into the dark beyond. There were no answers there, only distance, only movement. But it was enough. Behind him, the tamarisk swayed. A leaf landed near his foot. A fox barked faintly in the far distance. All around, the field held its breath. He would not dig again until morning. But for now, under the gaze of the moon, the furrows were full. Not of seed, not of water, but of stillness. And stillness was enough. He stood slowly, muscles protesting with soft cracks, and gathered the stick once more. It felt cool in his hand, but not cold. Just ready. As he walked back toward the fire, he traced one last line in the dust with his toe, a curve, wide and open, no meaning, no message, just presence. At the hearth, the embers waited, glowing low and warm. He added a few dry twigs, watched the flames rise, and placed the stick beside him as he sat. His hands were dirty, but he did not wash them. Not yet. The soil could stay for the night. The moon still shone, high and whole. And somewhere, out in the field, the furrows slept beneath her silver watch, dreaming of seeds that had not yet been sown. The morning came softly, with a hush that did not belong to silence but to something more sacred, an arrival of understanding. The first farmer opened his eyes before the birds, before the light had fully broken the sky, and sat in the half-shadow beside his hearth. His hands, calloused and stained with days of ash and soil, rested in his lap without urgency. Around him, the field lay like a great sleeping animal, breathing beneath its blanket of dew. Today felt like a threshold. He could not explain why, but it was in his bones, in the slow way his breath moved, in the stillness of the stick lying just beside him. He stood without sound and walked the well-worn path between tamarisk and furrow, passing each corner of the field with the quiet recognition one might offer old friends. He touched nothing, only walked, noticing the places where water had carved new curves into his straightest lines, where sprouts had grown taller without him, where his footprints from days before had been softened by the night's kiss of wind. At the center of the field, there was a place he often avoided, not out of fear, but uncertainty. A strip of ground that had never held his furrows, never grown much, never offered any clear reason for its silence. It was flatter than the rest, almost bare, with stones beneath the surface that made the stick shudder when pressed. But today, for reasons he could not name, he stood in the center of that space and waited. The wind stirred gently around his ankles, moving through the reeds, curling around the haft of the stick in his hand. He crouched and pressed the tip of the stick into the ground, not hard, not with force. He only placed it there, letting it rest in the shallowest layer of soil. Then he drew it back toward him in a single motion. The stick met resistance, then ease, then resistance again. But something had changed. The line it left behind did not collapse, did not crumble or scatter. It held. He drew another line beside it, this time slightly deeper. Then a third, curving gently as his wrist turned with the shape of the land. The lines held. They did not boast or gleam or shout, but they remained. He leaned back on his heels and looked at them in the early light. They weren't straighter than the others, nor more intricate. They were simple, but something in their shape made the breath catch gently in his chest. He began to work, not frantically, not with hope or hunger, only steadily, with the kind of care that asks for nothing in return. The stick moved through the soil as if the earth had been waiting for it all along. Stones shifted aside, clods broke quietly. He planted no seed yet, only carved. Furrow by furrow, in rhythm with the wind and the birds now beginning their morning music. There was no rush. By mid-morning, he had traced 7 rows. Each curved slightly to follow the contour of the land. He stopped and stood above them, letting the sweat dry on his skin. The rows didn't shine or beg to be seen. They simply existed, as if they had always been meant to be there. The first farmer placed his palm flat against the earth beside the last furrow and pressed down. The soil accepted the weight, but did not swallow it. It was firm, ready. He gathered a handful of seeds, Einkorn, the last of a small store saved from last season's lean harvest. Each grain bore the mark of waiting. He rolled them between his fingers, then dropped one into the furrow, then another, pacing himself with the rhythm of breath. He did not fill the rows, only one. That was enough. He pressed the soil gently over the seeds with his fingers, not the stick. Then sat back and watched. The light changed slowly. Bees passed by, uninterested. A small lizard warmed itself on a nearby stone. The furrow held. The line remained. It was the first that did not fade beneath weather or disappear in the shuffle of footsteps. It would remain until harvest, or until the land itself chose otherwise. Later, he stood and began smoothing the edges of the rows, firming the sides, whispering thanks not with words, but with the brush of his hands. His movements were slow and full, deliberate in their quiet. He had no need to measure the success. The furrow had held. That was the measure. The stick, though unchanged, felt different in his grip as he made his way back to the tamarisk. Not lighter, but steadier. It had known this moment before he had, perhaps. Known that all those days of testing, shell, stone, horn, ash, rest, had been part of finding this one true line. He placed the stick down beside the hearthstone, not leaning it, but laying it flat. His fingers lingered a moment along its grain, as if to thank it for knowing something he had only now begun to understand. That evening, he returned to the furrow, not to dig or to seed, only to sit beside it. The sky was streaked with copper and violet, the sun low and humming. He sat cross-legged at the field's edge and watched the light fold itself gently into the grooves he had carved. Shadows settled like water into the spaces between. The line held. He did not speak. He did not think. He only sat beside what had lasted. And as the stars began to prick through the darkening sky, the first farmer leaned back on his elbows, closed his eyes, and breathed with the land. The furrow remained, not perfect, not deep, but it held, and that, at last, was enough. The wind had already started its slow sweep across the plain when the first farmer woke. It moved with a sound like breath across skin, slipping through the tamarisk branches, brushing against the cloth he used for sleeping. He did not rise right away. His eyes stayed closed, and he let the wind speak first. It whispered of seeds and silence, of soil shaped and reshaped, of lines that stayed and others that vanished. It whispered of seasons gone and seasons coming, and the way between them was always slower than the mind could grasp. When he finally sat up, the fire was nothing but a circle of ash and one stubborn ember pulsing quietly at its center. He stirred it once with a twig, but did not add wood. There would be no need. The morning was warm enough. The day, he sensed, would not be one of making. He stood and walked barefoot toward the furrows, not because anything needed to be done, but because it felt right to go there, to greet them. The path was soft with dust, marked only by the faded press of his own footsteps and the tracks of a hare that had wandered through during the night. The field shimmered faintly with dew. The furrows held their shape, even now. That one, the one from yesterday, held especially well, catching the light in its groove as though it had been carved not by stick and hand, but by time itself. He stood there for a while. He did not count the rows. He didn't check the sprouts. He didn't carry the shell, or the horn, or the stone. The stick, his oldest companion, rested by the hearth, where he'd left it. It hadn't moved. It didn't need to. Everything that could be asked of it had already been given. He walked the length of the field once, trailing his fingers through the tops of the barley, feeling the hum of life pulsing up through their stalks. Some were stronger than others. Some leaned, some twisted. None were perfect. All were growing. That was enough. He sat beside the same furrow he'd carved under the moonlight, the one that had held its shape, the one into which he had pressed his breath, his time, his memory. The soil was warm. He leaned back on his hands and let the sun find his face. A beetle crawled past his foot, dragging a thread of straw behind it. He watched it, smiled faintly, then closed his eyes. The stick had never been named. Not once had he called it anything. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it had never needed a name to matter. It had started as a branch, taken by the river, dried by the sun, softened by his grip, darkened by rain and ash. It had scraped, pressed, traced, stirred, and rested. It had broken once. It had been mended, and now it waited. He thought back, though not with sharpness, only with that soft kind of memory that settles in the chest like warmth. He remembered the cracked earth, the trial with horn, the slicing edge of obsidian, the slow motion of shell against soil, the roots that refused and the ones that taught. He remembered the rain that dug better than he ever could. He remembered the fire, and the silence that asked him not to dig at all. All of it had been part of learning the land. But more than that, it had been about listening. He opened his eyes as a breeze lifted a thread of grass and dropped it into the furrow beside him. It fell without sound and stayed. He watched it rest there, and something in him did too. Later, he rose and walked back toward the hearth. The stick was where he had left it, lying across the stone. He picked it up, not to work, not to dig, but to feel it again in his hand. The curve fit the same. The balance remained. But it felt somehow complete. Not finished, just whole. He held it for a while, then placed it gently across the doorway of the shelter, where the sun could warm it and the wind could pass over it. He would still use it, of course, but something had settled now, deep in the marrow of the days. The line had been drawn. The seed had been planted. The hand had learned. He looked out across the field and let his breath slow with the wind. And in that wide, quiet hour before midday came, the first farmer stood still, shoulders at rest, eyes steady, hands empty. He had never called it a hoe, and he never needed to.